The distant wail of sirens sliced through the peaceful, pristine streets of Willowbrook Estates, an exclusive gated community where every blade of grass stood at perfect attention and every house gleamed under the weight of strict HOA regulations. As the fire truck sped toward the towering iron gates at the neighborhood entrance, its red and blue lights reflected off the marble-clad security booth, where a nervous guard hesitated before hitting the emergency override button. His radio crackled with static before a familiar voice, one dripping with a kind of entitlement only decades of unchecked power could forge, cut through the line like a blade. Jacob, absolutely not. No unauthorized vehicles enter without prior approval. You know the rules. Mrs. Evelyn Langley's voice was crisp, her words wrapped in the same smug self-assurance that had terrorized the community for years. The security guard's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his gaze shifting between the blaring emergency lights and the cold glare of the woman who had built an empire out of fines and fear. "Ma'am, it's the fire department," he stammered, his grip tightening around the radio. "There's an emergency call. Medical distress on Pinecrest Lane." The silence that followed felt heavier than the humid summer air hanging over the neighborhood. Then a scoff. "I don't care if the president himself is gasping for air on my front lawn. This is a private community. If they want access, they need to submit the proper paperwork like everyone else." Inside the fire truck, Captain Daniel Brooks clenched his jaw as his patience stretched dangerously thin. He had seen a lot in his 20 years on the force. Fires that swallowed entire families whole, wrecks that turned highways into graveyards, but nothing infuriated him more than people who let arrogance stand in the way of saving lives. He slammed his hand against the dashboard, then leaned into the radio. "You listen to me," he growled, his voice steady, but laced with the kind of authority that didn't ask for permission. "There's a man in critical condition, and every second you waste could be the difference between life and death. Open the gate." Evelyn Langley had spent the last 15 years molding Willowbrook Estates into what she saw as a utopia, but what the residents knew as a dictatorship. She ruled with an iron fist disguised as a manicured hand, doling out fines for mailbox colors that didn't match the official palette, threatening legal action over basketball hoops left out overnight, and banning garden gnomes with the justification that they disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. No one dared to defy her because those who had tried found themselves drowning in violation notices, their lives made miserable by the very rules meant to uphold the integrity of their community. She didn't just enforce the rules, she was the rules. HOA meetings were less about discussions and more about decrees, where she sat at the head of the table like a queen surveying her subjects. The residents didn't attend to have their voices heard. They attended to witness what new tyranny she would unveil. And yet, for all her control, her power, and her meticulously crafted reputation, she was about to learn the one lesson she had spent years ignoring. Power is only as strong as those who allow it to exist. As she stood at the gate, watching the fire truck idle just beyond her domain, she felt no fear, no guilt, no concern for the emergency unfolding on Pinecrest Lane. Instead, she felt a familiar thrill, a rush of satisfaction that came from exerting dominance, from knowing that even the fire department had to answer to her. "They can use the service entrance if it's that urgent," she said finally, her lips curling in a smirk. "But they will not, under any circumstances, barge into my neighborhood like it's some public freeway." She turned on her heel, her silk robe billowing behind her like the cape of an executioner, utterly unaware that the same authority she had wielded like a weapon for years was about to turn against her in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Inside a modest home on Pinecrest Lane, Arthur Reynolds lay on his recliner, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. The old man, once a high school history teacher who had spent decades shaping young minds, now found himself at the mercy of fate and bureaucracy. His daughter, Sarah, gripped his trembling hand, tears slipping down her cheeks as she shouted into the phone, begging the dispatcher to tell her why help hadn't arrived. Arthur's oxygen tank, his lifeline, was nearly empty, and with each passing second, his skin paled, his fingers twitching weakly as he tried, and failed, to speak. "Hang on, Dad," Sarah choked, her voice cracking under the weight of helplessness. They're coming. They have to be coming. But they weren't.
Not yet.
They were still stuck at the entrance, still arguing with a woman who had decided that the sanctity of her neighborhood's exclusivity was worth more than a human life. The irony of it all, the absolute, gut-wrenching absurdity, was that Arthur had been one of the few people who had always played by the rules. He had paid his dues, attended every HOA meeting, and even defended some of the more reasonable regulations. And now, as he gasped for air, he realized the cold, bitter truth. Compliance had never mattered. No amount of following the rules would have changed the fact that he was now trapped, suffocating, in a home that he had spent his life maintaining for a community that would rather let him die than break protocol. Captain Brooks was done waiting. He threw open the truck's door, boots hitting the pavement with a kind of force that echoed authority. His team followed, standing in formation behind him as he stormed toward the security booth, his eyes locked onto the trembling guard. "Move," he ordered, his voice sharp, his patience non-existent. But before the guard could react, a figure stepped into his path. "Mrs. Langley, I will have you arrested for trespassing," she announced, her voice ringing with manufactured righteousness. "This is a legal matter, and you will not intimidate me into breaking protocol." Brooks took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze narrowing. "A man is dying," he said, his voice dangerously low.
Right now.
"And you're worried about protocol?" He gestured toward the crowd of residents gathering around, their faces etched with unease, anger, and, most importantly, defiance. For years, Langley had ruled without question, but now, the people were watching, waiting to see what happened when a force greater than her ego stood its ground. "Open the gate," Brooks repeated, this time not as a request, but as an ultimatum. Langley smirked. "Over my dead body." And then, as if the universe itself had been waiting for those words, something shifted in the air. A faint smell. Something acrid. Something burning. The first tendrils of smoke slithered into view, curling above the rooftops like ghostly fingers reaching for the sky. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as heads turned, confusion melting into horror. "Is that?" someone whispered, pointing toward the source of the smoke. And then, like a cruel twist of fate, the realization dawned. The fire wasn't coming from Pinecrest Lane. It was coming from Langley's backyard. Her estate. Her fortress. A spark, perhaps from one of the elegant lanterns she had installed along the perimeter, or maybe from the flickering candles still glowing on her pristine patio table, had ignited the dry brush along her property line. The flames licked hungrily at the wooden pergola she had boasted about in every HOA newsletter, spreading like judgment from the heavens. For the first time, Langley's smirk faltered. "No," she whispered, spinning to face the fire that was now climbing toward her perfectly trimmed hedges. She turned back to Brooks, panic replacing arrogance. "Do something." Brooks folded his arms, tilting his head. "Oh, I'd love to," he said, his voice laced with a satisfaction so potent it could melt steel. "But unfortunately, you're blocking emergency access." Langley paled. For the first time in her life, she was no longer in control. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be at the mercy of rules. Rules she had created, rules she had weaponized, and rules that, in the end, had turned against her in the most poetic way possible.